accommodate future growth. I think I just want to start by saying that in terms of the takeaway from this presentation, I'm hoping a couple of things. Number one, I'm hoping to illustrate how rapidly the practice of form-based coding is advancing. Over the course of writing our book, which was now about 5 years ago, we had to rewrite 2 to 3 chapters several times because the practice had advanced so quickly, even over the course of a few months that we were writing the book, and we're finding that as well in jumping into the second edition of that. And then secondly, I just to reinforce and introduce and reinforce the Form-Based Code Institute as a really invaluable resource to stay on top of this advancing practice of form-based coding. Go ahead and jump into this. I have to start off my form-based code presentation.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're getting your presentation video.
Whoops.
There. We got it.
Great. Luckily, I was only one slide in. Thanks, Zep. So I like to start off with this image of the Polaroid camera to put a little bit of a thought-provoking point on the table, and I feel pretty strongly that Euclidean design is an out-of-date operating system, and it really cannot keep up the demands of planning and developing in complex urban environments. And just in a similar way, I like to use the analogy in the same way that you wouldn't use a Polaroid camera today to take a picture that you wanted to email to somebody. I feel that Euclidean design is really the wrong tool, and I think that's what a lot of us are finding in our practices, and you are finding in your day-to-day planning and practices as well. And so I do feel that form-based coding is one of the ways that we're introducing a new operating system that can effectively address the complexities of complex, walkable urban development. So I've got a series of points that I just wanted to make. I know most of you have sat through quite a few form-based code training in the past, so I'm assuming there's 101 level sort of the table already, but I wanted to reinforce some of what you heard and then introduce some more advanced topics. For example, I want to first talk about what is a form-based code, and in terms of I don't jump into, I think I flipped through a few of the presentations that have been done there regionally. I don't want to jump into that diagram that shows use, form management, and shows that form needs to become the priority, because I think we all could agree upon that. It's just more in terms of interpreting that diagram and actually thinking in more detail about what it means to effectively write a form-based code. And I just want to reinforce one portion of the Form-Based Code Institute's definition, is that form-based codes use physical form rather than the separation of uses as the organizing principle. And I think this is an extremely important point, and one that's a bit hard to understand at first, but I wanted to just go through a few points to reinforce that concept in terms of getting to effective form-based code. The flow that I just want to throw out there in terms of that is that you really have to be sure to replace your use-based zones with form-based zones to create an effective system. We've seen a lot of instances in places across the country where they're just simply adding additional form regulations on top of the existing use-based zones. And in some instances, it's a bit more helpful, but it's not nearly as effective as you'd be with replacing existing use-based zones with the form-based zones. This is an example extracted from our Cincinnati form-based code, which Mike mentioned earlier, was adopted approximately a year ago. 4 different neighborhoods have mapped and implemented the form-based code in the past year. And the point of this was just simply to show that this is one of the intent illustrations for a zone that called small footprint urban neighborhood. And the form intent, just simply in this graphic, is extremely clear, and it's based on the unique patterns of the that we studied to actually create this foundation. So the form and the unique patterns and forms of these Cincinnati neighborhoods, the basis for these new form-based zones that can very effectively regulate development in these areas. The second example that I wanted to use is we're currently working on the citywide development code update for the city of Austin to implement their comprehensive plan called Imagine Austin, which has 8 priority programs, and the last one of those is updating their development regulations. And what we're doing as we're diving into the diagnosis of Austin's current land development code, is they have a use-based system, which is pretty common, that differentiate or does not differentiate the patterns of the single-family neighborhoods that you see on the left-hand side, which are a bit more suburban in nature, in comparison to those on the right-hand side that are the central Austin neighborhoods. They them in terms of use, and they're both single-family, and so they classify them as SF3. So what they've done over the course of the years is they've taken those use-based zones, they've simply began to layer overlays on top of those use-based zones, and they, you know, the typical zone has 6 or 7 overlays that make the code nearly impossible to use. And on top of that, which is typical in most instances, they also have the historic overlay that just makes the context and the regulations even more complicated. And so the real problem is that they never got rid of the ineffective foundation of these based zones. In an instance like this, what we'll likely think about recommending, in a lot of the instances, especially in the central Austin context, is that the new form-based zones replace the existing use-based ones, and that use, you know, as we think about a lot, becomes secondary as a supplement to the form-based foundation that's created in the new form-based zones. Rule 2 is that a hierarchy of form is the organizing system. And I'll jump in to tell you a little bit more about what that means. Is basically just thinking at a most basic level, form-based zones should really go from the smallest in terms of form and the least urban or the least intense to the intense. And this is, I just wanted to use the calibrated Cincinnati transect to show this, that it's very clear and work from the left-hand side of this image to the right, that you're getting more intense and the form is getting more compact, and there's clear hierarchy in this that then transitions to the even more urban and the more intense areas at the other end of the transect. So let me just show you that again, so you can just look from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, going from the least urban to the more urban. And that hierarchy of the form becomes the organizing principle for the whole code. And what this diagram shows is that in a conventional code, every aspect of the code ties back to the organizing system of use. And what we need to get to with the form-based code is every aspect of the code very carefully about and relating back to that hierarchy of form and the intended form of each of those different zones. This is just an example. We were teaching at a class recently, and there was I won't tell where this is from, but this is an extract from a document that this city had gotten. They had asked for a form-based code, and they were really confused about why the form-based code wasn't working very well when achieving the results they had intended it for. And so simply by opening this page and looking at the list of zones here, which are all use-based, I could immediately tell them that they have a document in a zoning system that has some form standards. The real organizing system of this code is still use. And now it does add mixed use as one of the zones, but I'll show you in a little bit that even the mixed use zone doesn't have a really clear intended form. Rule 3 is not just about the zone standards, but it's about an entire system or code often run into this question about, well, why does it cost, this amount of money to do a form-based code? Can't we just simply add a few used zones? And we tell them is that to be truly effective is you need to introduce an entire system. And I'm going to fairly quickly go through this, but I wanted to show the form-based code components, thinking about them in terms of the analogy of these components being like a proven recipe that have proven success in applications all across the country. The first is a regulating plan, and so, yeah. The first component is the regulating plan. In our first glimpse, this looks fairly similar to a zoning map, but what this map is actually regulating is that hierarchy of intended from intense, darkest of the areas to the least intense forms in the lighter of the areas. And this is for our Flagstaff, Arizona citywide development code update for one of the focus areas of the form-based code application. In terms of the regulating plan and a more detailed vision, created a master plan for the Petaluma, California Smart Station area. And just want to show that in the smaller project areas, a more detailed regulating plan is often necessary and often created as part of the form-based code. And that the regulating plan at this scale becomes much more than just about the mapping of the zones, but it's really about reinforcing some very unique desired characteristics of form for these project areas. Standards are, the part of the form-based code that most people think about first. Think about form-based coding. Unfortunately, what we're seeing a lot of is just people picking up some of our colleagues' codes, our codes, or even the SMART code, and just directly applying the standards and the numbers that are within the tables in those documents without a calibration. And so I think a couple of points to make is what's important in terms of building form standards is it's about blending compatible form versus separating uses. And this is just an example from a new community in East Beach, East Beach in Norfolk, Virginia, that is a great example of townhouses and live-work unit being integrated very closely and compactly into a primarily single-family neighborhood. So I just want to make the point that the numbers within the tables, within the building form standards need to be very carefully tested. We'll typically take standard and typical lot sizes within the community we're writing a code for and test different desired forms and basically work our way backwards from those desired forms back into the standards and the numbers that work their way into the building form standards. An important point that I wanted to make in terms of the building form standards is a form-based code should be about more than just addressing sort of how to regulate mixed use. In a lot of our codes, especially the citywide code updates we're writing, is we're also addressing diverse walkable neighborhoods and thinking very carefully about what we call missing middle housing, which are these housing types that you can see in this diagram between the single family home, the mid-rise sort of garden apartment that are really valuable the way that diverse walkable neighborhoods function. And I had the opportunity, seeing you as well as a few times being back in Salt Lake City to really begin to understand and assess the missing middle housing that already exists. In historic central Salt Lake City neighborhoods, you've got a really great palette of these missing middle types already that the form coding that is applied to these neighborhoods should really begin to reinforce and pick up. And there's also a really great mix of these missing middle types in the data project, which is really great to see in new development as well. And, the missing middle housing has similarities across the country, but very unique cultural and sort of climatic considerations come into play in refining the palette types that get documented and ultimately get regulated within a form-based code. What we've found is this is an image from Austin. It's a little fourplex building, and the calculated density is almost 40 dwelling units per acre, and there wasn't a single zone that actually allowed this particular missing middle housing type or the range of missing middle housing types that Austin is trying to encourage. So one thing that the form-based code application does in places like this is actually create zones regulated primarily by density that reintroduce this range of housing types within the neighborhood. Another point I wanted to make is that it is impossible to create blended densities if you regulate a zone by density. This is a great new urbanist neighborhood being built in King City, California, that has a great mix of townhouses at 8 units per acre, Muse houses at 15, single-family homes that range between 9 and 12 units per acre, and a courtyard housing type that you can see in the lower right-hand corner that's up to 30 dwelling units per acre. So you could see that if you simply regulated this neighborhood by density, you'd almost immediately sort of prohibit this type of blending of densities in the mix of housing types that are necessary to create a diverse neighborhood. Type standards regulate that transition from the public realm or the sidewalk into the private realm, which is either the yard or into the building itself. I really find that it's extremely invaluable to regulate this frontage type condition. Because for some odd reason, we've forgotten how to design a good frontage. And so if you don't regulate, you end up getting results like this where, you know, a building with no transparency at the shop, the level, an arcade that's not deep enough place for two people to walk side by side in, and a sidewalk that's, you know, with the placement and the bench placement, is pretty much dysfunctional from a retail and a shopping standpoint. Building type standards have become a really important part of our codes. They play a different role in different practitioners' codes. But just as an example, in the Cincinnati form-based code, we actually, through a series of documentation efforts, established a palette of building types that helped us directly inform and refine form-based codes as we drafted the code itself and applied to different areas throughout Cincinnati.
Dan?
Yes.
Really quickly, just a reminder, anybody on the call, please mute your audio or microphone. There's a lot of feedback that's coming through and getting the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. So then civic space standards, and pretty straightforward, but you know, when you get to the point of the smaller scale project areas, you can get into some pretty detailed regulating plans that integrate both the, you know, the thoroughfare standards as well as the civic space standards when you're working at a citywide scale like we have in several instances. This becomes mostly applicable to projects, small project areas as developers or the city agencies kind of dive down into more detailed planning. And the thoroughfare standards are just, I like to just continue to reinforce the importance of making sure that you address thoroughfares within your form-based coding efforts, because in a place like this, which is a context in Richmond, California, that we are creating a form-based code for, is you imagine that it would be extremely hard in a context like this to encourage private investment to basically pull buildings up to the street edge and try to create a vibrant pedestrian realm without first thinking about major changes and improvements to the thoroughfare standards or the public realm. So we just, every project we work on, reinforce that. And even the projects where we've, Livermore, California, Flagstaff, Arizona, where we've done citywide development code updates, we're able to keep the thoroughfare standards in the zoning portion of the document so that it creates a dialogue between the local engineers and the local planners so they come to the table and make decisions about thoroughfare design when the questions come up. The second point that I want to make and jump into is that we're finding out that not all approaches to thinking about form and regulating urban form are created equal. I wrote an issue of zoning practice that was published about a year ago, May of last year. I introduced this table in that I think is a really important one for all of us to start really thinking about. In terms of this diagram, or this table is beginning to classify the approaches and compare them in terms of their comprehensive nature and effectiveness. And getting into that table and going through it fairly quickly is the first, starting with kind of the least comprehensive and typically the least effective. And I guess I want to step back and say there's nothing wrong with choosing to do any level of these approaches. I think it's just important to understand how they fit within the context of a more comprehensive and less comprehensive approaches. And the first approach that we see quite a bit of the cities just simply adding their existing Euclidean code and adding graphics and to the use-based codes without making major changes. And we actually don't recommend this option. Of all the options, we find it's the one option that gets people excited, but ultimately when the rubber hits the road, the code doesn't perform any better. After you get kind of through the good graphics, the actual content doesn't perform very well. The second approach is adding site guidelines, site planning guidelines to an existing Euclidean code. And this is the point I was making earlier about simply adding an additional form layer on top of a pre-existing Euclidean code can help out to an extent, but if you think about places for like Austin, for example, that created multiple layers of overlays, form overlays, and addressed the idea of creating a form-based foundation, can only be so effective. And so what we're doing in this document, starting to begin to give different names to these different approaches so that we're not calling them all form-based codes, but rather they have specific names so that we can compare them. Then adding use zones to a Euclidean use-based code, you know, a lot of this starting kind of in the mid-1980s, a really good sort of effort to try to regulate more diverse mixed-use, more diverse urban environments. What we're finding now is just, I would actually prefer that we actually stopped using the term mixed use because it's extremely vague and can mean a number of different things to different people. The fourth approach is, you know, to be fairly comprehensive where you're adding new graphics, reorganizing the code, clean up, you know, administration and procedures and making minor changes to development standards. But you're still not thinking about form as the organizing structure. You know, this can be a pretty effective effort, but, you know, we're thinking about, you know, the classification of this as a code cleanup and reorganization. And then on that side, basically jumping into, I guess, what we as the Form-Based Code Institute talk about in terms of what we would classify as form-based coding, where you have an optional form-based code overlay. You know, it may be a parallel system that gives the developer an alternative to actually completely replace existing zoning with the form-based code. Or it's a system that the city can apply on a project area basis and replace existing coding, whether it be a TOD plan or a neighborhood plan or a town plan, where they sort of map form-based codes onto the zoning map. The second one is integrating, the sixth one is integrating a complete Open the audio's back. It's integrating a complete form-based code within a pre-existing zoning code, and call that a parallel form-based code. And this is an example of where we've applied this is in Mesa, Arizona. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then this one is using form. It's the most comprehensive, the most complex. It's actually stepping back and using form as an organizing principle for an entire zoning code, and using form-based components as the driver for the table of contents. And examples of that are Flagstaff, Arizona, and Livermore, California development codes. And let me just jump into, I'm just going to through this slide because I'm running a little bit over here. So the next category that I wanted to talk about is actually real briefly plugging the form-based code into the overall code, because this is a topic that there's been a lot of questions about, and there's often a lot of confusion about in terms of how to do it effectively. I'm going to do it very quickly. I wanted to introduce the topic, and it's something that we do talk about in quite a bit of detail in the Form-Based Code Institute courses. This option is simply creating a separate form-based code chapter or division and integrating it into the overall table of contents. This is the example of the Mesa, Arizona overall zoning code table of contents, and you can see that the form-based code